the most feared empire attacked Earth, it regretted it forever. The first missile hit Chicago at 6:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, which meant the commuter trains were running and the coffee shops were open, and approximately 4 million people were already awake and moving through their lives when the sky changed color and the windows blew in. The Keth Empire had been planning the strike for 11 years. They had studied Earth with the patient thoroughness of a civilization that had conquered 32 worlds, and understood that preparation was the difference between a campaign that lasted weeks and one that lasted decades. They had cataloged humanity's military installations, mapped the defensive grid, identified the command structures, assessed the psychological profile of a species that had been in the Galactic Accord for 14 years, and had spent most of those 14 years being carefully, diplomatically, relentlessly non-threatening. They had read the diplomatic files, the conflict resolution records, the careful measured responses to provocations that the Accord's more aggressive species had occasionally tested them with. The Keth Strategic Assessment had concluded, after 11 years of study, that humanity was a mid-tier military power with significant defensive capability, moderate offensive reach, strong institutional cohesion, and a demonstrated preference for resolution over escalation. The assessment was thorough, it was detailed, it was supported by 11 years of intelligence data. It was wrong in the specific way that assessments are wrong when the people writing them understand what they're looking at but not what it means. The Keth opened the attack on 17 simultaneous targets across 4 continents. Not a declaration of war, the Keth didn't issue declarations. They issued results. 31 years of empire building had taught them that the psychological impact of sudden, overwhelming, coordinated violence was worth more strategically than any diplomatic preamble. You hit everything at once. You hit it hard. You let the shock do the work that negotiations never could. Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, London, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, Sydney, Moscow, 17 cities in 4 seconds, with the specific brutal elegance of a military machine that had done this 32 times and knew exactly how much force was required to break a civilization's will before it could organize a coherent response. What the Keth had not factored into their assessment, what 11 years of studying humanity's Accord-era behavior had not revealed, because the Accord era was 14 years old, and humanity was 4,000 years older than that, was what happened to this specific species when someone hit their cities on a Tuesday morning while the coffee shops were open. The Keth Empire had conquered 32 worlds. They had never conquered a world that had been fighting itself for 4 millennia. They had never conquered a world that had looked at the worst things humans could do to each other and spent 4,000 years getting better at surviving them. They had never conquered a species that heard the sound of a missile hitting Chicago and didn't freeze, didn't panic, didn't begin the calculus of surrender that every other species had begun in the first 30 minutes of a Keth opening strike. They had conquered 32 worlds. They were about to learn that 33 was different. Major Carla Reyes was in the operations center at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado when the alert came through, and the first thing she did, before the second alert, before the damage reports started rolling in, before the chain of command began its cascade of emergency protocols, was look at the threat assessment board and understand the geometry of what had just happened. 17 simultaneous strikes, coordinated to the second, from an approach vector that had used Earth's own moon as a sensor shadow, which meant whoever had done this had been patient enough to calculate a lunar transit window and had planned this attack for at least 6 months at the orbital level, probably longer at the strategic level. The warheads had been kinetic impactors, not nuclear, not energy weapons, kinetic, which meant the attacker had decided that the psychological impact of a kinetic strike on a populated area was more useful than the total destruction a nuclear warhead would have produced. They wanted damage and horror, not ash. That was a choice, That choice told her something. Reyes had been doing threat assessment for 11 years. She looked at the geometry and the choice and the patience and the lunar transit window, and she understood, in the specific fast way that people understand things when the thing being understood is urgent, that this was not opportunistic. This was the opening move of something that had been planned. She opened the command channel. Colonel Marcus Webb answered on the second tone. He was already awake. The alerts had gone out simultaneously across every base in the network, and his voice had the flat, focused quality of someone who had moved past the initial shock and was already in the part where you did things. "Raise," he said. "Sir, I have preliminary attack geometry. 17 targets, simultaneous strike, kinetic impactors, lunar transit approach. This is a planned first strike by an organized military force. We don't have an accord species with this capability and this attack profile." Unknown contact. Unknown contact. I'm running the impactor signatures against the database now, but I don't expect a match. If they planned 11 years of approach, they plan to be unrecognized. She paused. "Sir, the strike is designed to shock, not destroy. They hit cities, but they hit them at yield levels that cause massive casualties and structural damage without total city destruction. They want us scared and disorganized, not bombed back to pre-industrial." "Why does that matter?" "Because it means they're coming," Reyes said. "This isn't the attack. This is the preparation for the attack. They're softening us psychologically before a ground or orbital assault. We have." She ran the calculation. "If I'm right about this being a prepared campaign, we have somewhere between 6 and 72 hours before the next phase." Webb was quiet for 2 seconds. "How confident are you?" 80%, Reyes said. "The geometry is too clean for a one-time strike. This is a campaign opening." "All right," Webb said. "I'm taking this up the chain. Keep running the database." He closed the channel. Reyes turned back to her board and kept working, because that was what you did. You kept working. The coffee she'd been drinking when the alert came in was still on her desk, cold now, because she'd been at the board for 4 minutes, and she didn't touch it because it was cold and she had things to do. In Chicago, the emergency response was already moving. Not because someone gave an order, because Chicago had emergency response infrastructure and emergency response people, and those people had spent their careers training for the worst things they could imagine, and the worst thing they could imagine had just happened, and so they moved. Ambulances into the impact zones. Fire suppression teams toward the structural fires that the kinetic impactors had started in 3 downtown blocks. Hospital emergency protocols engaged at every facility within 20 miles. The National Guard mobilized from their armory on the north side by a lieutenant colonel named Diana Osei, who had been eating breakfast when the windows blew in and had been in her car and moving 30 seconds later. That was Chicago. Los Angeles was the same. New York was the same. London, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, Sydney, Moscow, 17 cities, and in every one of them the first response was not panic. Or rather, panic existed. Panic always existed. It was a human thing and a true thing, and pretending otherwise was dishonest. But the panic was the background, and the response was the foreground, because humans had spent 4,000 years building the kind of institutional muscle memory that meant when the worst thing happened, the structures that existed to respond to it responded to it, whether or not the people inside those structures felt afraid. They felt afraid. They responded anyway. The Keth observation satellites, positioned at the Lagrange points in a configuration that their commanders had been confident was undetectable, watched this and transmitted their data back to the fleet, which was currently positioned in a holding pattern behind Mars, and the fleet commanders read the data and held a briefing, and the briefing produced a conclusion that the commanders had not expected to produce this early in the campaign. The conclusion was, the psychological preparation phase had not worked as designed. The Keth's 32 previous campaigns had produced a consistent pattern in the first 6 hours after an opening strike. Civilian population centers showed movement consistent with flight. Military installations showed response patterns consistent with emergency reorganization. Government communications showed volume spikes consistent with leadership seeking information and attempting coordination. All of this was normal and expected and produced a window, typically between 12 and 36 hours, during which the target civilization was simultaneously shocked, disorganized, and attempting to process what had happened. That window was when you brought the fleet in. That window was when you converted the psychological impact of the opening strike into the political reality of a regime that understood it had lost. The pattern was not appearing. Civilian movement in the strike cities was not flight consistent. It was response consistent, people moving toward impact zones rather than away from them. Military installation activity was not reorganization consistent. It was deployment consistent, forces moving outward from bases in coordinated patterns that suggested not a scramble to understand the situation, but a transition to pre-planned contingency protocols that had apparently been ready to activate. Government communications volume had spiked, yes, but the content analysis, such as the Keth's translation systems could process in real time, showed coordination rather than confusion. Leadership was not seeking information. Leadership was issuing orders. The fleet commander, a Keth senior officer named Arch-Commander Vel Drathos, looked at the data and said something that no Keth commander had said in 31 years of Imperial expansion. He said, "Run the assessment again." His intelligence officer ran the assessment again. The result was the same. Drathos looked at the assessment for a long time. He was 60 years old. He had participated in 9 planetary conquests as a fleet officer and commanded 3 as an arch-commander. He had a record that the Keth Empire used as a training case study for junior officers. He had never, in 60 years of military life, looked at an opening strike data report and found the result he was looking at now. "The psychological preparation window," he said, "is not opening," his intelligence officer said. "Sir, the population response patterns are consistent with a civilization that has pre-existing mass casualty response infrastructure and is activating it. The military response patterns are consistent with pre-planned defensive protocols being executed." A pause. They were ready for this. "Nobody is ready for a first strike," Drathos said. "That's the point of a first strike." "Sir," the intelligence officer hesitated in the way junior officers hesitated when they had something to say that they were not certain would be well received. "The Terran Confederacy has a military doctrine. I reviewed it during the campaign preparation phase. They have something called the Continuity of Operations Protocol. It's designed to maintain governmental and military function through any single catastrophic event up to and including total destruction of a primary command facility. It doesn't require the existing leadership to survive. It requires the existing plans to survive." Another pause. "Their plans survived, sir. We hit their cities, but we didn't hit the plans. And the plans were already running before we completed the strike package." Drathos was quiet. He looked at the tactical display. At Earth, rotating slowly. At the 17 impact sites, visible as thermal signatures from this range. At the military installation activity indicators scattered across 4 continents, all showing the same deployment-consistent pattern. "The window," he said. "How long before their defensive posture is fully established?" "At current deployment rate 6 hours, possibly less." Drathos thought about 32 worlds and the specific reliable pattern of shock and disorganization, and the window that pattern produced. He thought about the 11 years of campaign preparation and the strategic assessment, and the conclusion that humanity was a mid-tier military power with a preference for resolution over escalation. He thought about the 17 cities and the response patterns that were not what they should have been. Accelerate the timeline, he said. We go to the primary assault phase in 4 hours, before they're fully established. Sir, 4 hours means we arrive before our forward logistics. 4 hours, Drathos said. His staff moved. Reyes was on her 6th hour of continuous operations work when the detection came through, and it came through on the new long-range array that Peterson had brought online 8 months ago. The array that the Keth's orbital observation didn't know about because it had been built in a mountain, and its emission signature was designed to look like geological activity. She looked at the contact data and felt her stomach drop in the specific way. It dropped when a calculation you'd made and hoped was wrong turned out to be right. 240 contacts, behind Mars, moving. Not a patrol fleet, not a survey formation, a battle fleet, the specific density and configuration of a military force organized for planetary assault. She ran the numbers against the database and got nothing, which was what she'd expected, and then she ran the approach vector and the timeline and got something she had not expected. 4 hours. They were coming in 4 hours. She had told Webb 6 to 72. 6 was the lower bound, and she'd said it knowing 6 was unlikely, knowing the more probable range was 12 to 36, knowing that 6 was the scenario where everything had gone wrong. 4 was less than 6. She opened the command channel. This time it went straight to the Joint Chiefs. General Patricia Acaffer answered. She was the chairman, which meant she had been in the command bunker under the White House since approximately 7 minutes after the first strike, which meant she had been running the response for 6 hours on no sleep and the specific kind of stimulants that the military issued for exactly this situation. Reyes, Acaffer said. General, 240 contacts behind Mars. Approach vector, arrival estimate 4 hours. This is the primary assault fleet. A pause. 4 hours, Acaffer said. Yes, ma'am. Not 6. No, ma'am. My lower bound was 6. I think the opening strike response pattern surprised them, and they're accelerating their timeline. Another pause, shorter. They saw us respond, Acaffer said. Yes, ma'am. I think they expected the opening strike to produce a psychological window, and it didn't, and they're trying to arrive before we're fully postured. Are we fully postured? Reyes looked at the deployment indicators. At 6 hours of continuous military activity across 4 continents and orbital space, and the lunar installations, and the Mars Colonial Defense Forces. At the specific accumulated result of 6 hours of continuity of operations, protocol running on a military that had been building contingency plans for alien contact scenarios for 30 years. No, ma'am, she said. We're at approximately 70%. We need 2 more hours. We have 4. Yes, ma'am. What's the shortfall? Orbital defense grid is at 60% activation. The remaining 40% requires either 2 more hours on the standard protocol, or we push the activation manually and accept some sensor gaps. Accept the gaps, Acaffer said immediately. Yes, ma'am. And the lunar installations, the heavy rail systems are at full readiness, but the targeting coordination network needs another 90 minutes to complete calibration. Uncalibrated rail systems. They'll be accurate to within 3%, ma'am. Against a fleet of 240, 3% error rate is acceptable. Acaffer was quiet for 1 second. All right, anything else? The Accord, Reyes said. We should transmit not a distress signal, an information package. Everything we have on the attack profile, the fleet configuration, the approach vector. Every Accord species needs to know what's coming. Why? Because if this fleet takes Earth, Reyes said, the next target is whoever we were friendly with. And because if we survive this, we're going to want allies who know exactly what happened. Acaffer said, already sent 20 minutes ago. A pause. Reyes. Ma'am. Good work, keep watching. The channel closed. Ray's turned back to her board. The coffee was still there, still cold. She picked it up and drank it because cold coffee was still coffee, and she had 3.5 hours until the Keth battle fleet arrived, and she was going to spend every second of those 3.5 hours watching and working and making sure that when the time came, the people who needed to make decisions had the best possible picture of what they were deciding about. That was her job. She was very good at her job. The thing about the Keth battle fleet approaching Earth on that Tuesday in October was that it had been designed for a specific kind of war against a specific kind of opponent. Arch-Commander Drathos had spent his career fighting opponents who had, at the moment of confrontation, approximately the technological level they had advertised, and approximately the military capacity they had displayed. The Keth strategic doctrine was built on precision and overwhelming force delivered at the point of maximum psychological vulnerability, not brute force precision. The fleet's configuration reflected this. Fast attack vessels concentrated at the forward edge, fire support platforms in the middle distance, logistics and command elements protected at the rear. It was a configuration that worked beautifully against opponents who responded to the initial shock by attempting to protect their most valuable assets, because protecting your most valuable assets meant concentrating your defenses where your most valuable assets were, which meant the fast attack vessels found the concentrated defenses and engaged them while the fire support platforms destroyed the infrastructure that was no longer protected because its defenders had moved to the concentration point. 32 times this had worked. It required an opponent who responded to the initial shock by protecting their most valuable assets. General Patricia Acaffer had not, in 30 years of military service, ever attended a single training exercise that was built around protecting the most valuable assets. Every exercise she had ever run, every doctrine she had ever taught, every strategic framework she had ever studied in the United States military tradition was built around a different principle entirely. The principle was, you don't protect your assets by concentrating your defense. You protect your assets by making the attack on them too costly to complete. The distinction was subtle in theory and absolute in practice. When the Keth battle fleet crossed the Mars orbital line at 11:23 in the morning, they found a defensive arrangement that did not match any of their 32 previous campaign data sets. The orbital defense grid, 70% active on the standard protocol, 83% active on the accelerated push with acceptable sensor gaps, was not concentrated around population centers or military installations. It was distributed, spread across the entire orbital approach corridor in overlapping coverage zones, each zone independently functional, designed so that destroying any individual element did not compromise the coverage of the elements adjacent to it. The Keth fast attack vessels hit the forward edge of the grid and discovered that hitting the forward edge did not create a breakthrough point. It created a localized gap that the adjacent elements immediately began compensating for, drawing the attack deeper into the grid rather than through it. And deeper into the grid meant deeper into the overlapping coverage zones, where the fire support elements were more exposed than they had been at the outer edge. It took the Keth fleet commander 8 minutes to understand that the grid was not organized around anything he could destroy to collapse it. It was organized around the assumption that elements would be destroyed and had been designed to remain functional anyway. He had never fought a defensive grid designed by people who assumed they were going to lose parts of it. He had never fought a defensive grid designed by people who had spent 4,000 years fighting each other and had learned, the expensive way, that the only grid that works is one that doesn't break when it loses pieces. Drathos, watching the engagement data from the command element at the fleet's rear, said to his tactical officer, "They're drawing us in." "Sorry." "The grid is drawing us in. The gaps aren't failures, they're invitations. They want the fast attack elements deeper in the coverage zone. He looked at the formation display. Pull back the forward elements. The order went out. The forward elements received it and began to comply. They had not finished complying when the lunar installations opened fire. The heavy rail systems on the moon's surface had been installed 30 years ago, funded by a military budget line that had been politically controversial at the time, and had been defended by a series of generals who had argued, against significant civilian skepticism, that maintaining a kinetic strike capability from the lunar surface provided a deterrent against exactly the kind of scenario that was now unfolding. The rails fired projectiles, dense metal cylinders, no warhead, no guidance system, pure kinetic energy delivered at the velocity that the moon's gravity well, and the rail system's acceleration profile produced. They were not precise weapons. They were not meant to be precise weapons. They were meant to be weapons that hit things very hard at velocities that made the impact of a kinetic impactor into a city look modest, and they could fire faster than any point defense system could track them all. 3% error rate at this range. Reyes had said it. Okafor had accepted it. 3% of 240 contacts was 7.2 ships. Call it 7 ships that got missed entirely due to targeting error. 233 ships got hit. Not destroyed. A single rail projectile, even at lunar velocity, did not necessarily destroy a heavy warship, but hit, damaged, systems disrupted, hull integrity compromised, shields stressed, crews shaken. 233 ships that had been advancing through an orbital defense grid, while pulling back, their forward elements were now also dealing with damage assessment and structural alerts, and the specific disorientation of a crew whose ship had just been hit by something moving fast enough that the point defense system hadn't flagged it as incoming before it arrived. Drathos felt his flagship shudder. He looked at the damage report, midship impact, structural compromise in sections 4 through 6, drive output reduced to 91%, shields cycling. He looked at the formation display. At 233 damaged ships, at the defensive grid that was still 78% operational despite everything the forward elements had done to it, at the lunar surface where the rail systems were already cycling for a second salvo. He had never had a flagship hit in 31 years. He had never had 233 ships hit simultaneously by weapons he hadn't cataloged as active. He opened his channel to the intelligence officer. "The lunar rail systems," he said. "They were in our pre-campaign assessment." "Yes, sir. Assessed as non-operational, last confirmed activity was 19 years ago in a military exercise. We assessed them as decommissioned." "They were not decommissioned," Drathos said. "No, sir. What else in our assessment was similarly not accurate?" The intelligence officer was quiet. "Everything," Drathos said, not as a question. "The second lunar salvo hit. And the third." And while the lunar systems were firing, the orbital grid elements that the fast attack vessels hadn't destroyed began their own engagement. Not with the fast attack vessels at the forward edge, which had already taken significant rail damage and were now dealing with systems disruptions, but with the fire support platforms in the middle distance, which had advanced into positions that made strategic sense against the defensive arrangement the Keth had expected to find, and made no strategic sense against the defensive arrangement they had actually found. The fire support platforms were not designed for the role they were now in. They were designed to provide long-range fire support against hardened surface targets after the fast attack vessels had broken the orbital defense. They were not designed to be in the middle distance of an orbital engagement against a grid that was firing from multiple independent nodes at a fire support platform that had committed to a position optimized for ground attack. They were, in the specific military vocabulary that several of the platform commanders used in their final transmissions, in the wrong place. Reyes watched all of this on her board, tracking the engagement data in real time, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel in the middle of an alien battle fleet attacking Earth. She felt like the assessment had been right. Not her assessment. The assessment embedded in 30 years of doctrine and 30 years of budget arguments and 30 years of generals telling skeptical civilians that the lunar rails were worth maintaining and the distributed grid was worth the complexity and the continuity of operations protocol was worth the cost. The assessment that said, if someone ever does this, we will still be here. Colonel Webb was on the channel. Reyes status. Sir, the Keth fleet is in significant disarray. Forward elements are heavily engaged with the grid, fire support platforms are out of position. Lunar systems have completed 3 salvos and are cycling for a 4th. Fleet cohesion is, she checked the formation analysis. They've lost command coordination in the forward third. The rear elements are holding, but they're not advancing. Are they retreating? Reyes looked at the data, at the formation, at the specific indicators of a fleet that was making decisions about what to do next. Not yet, she said, but they're about to be. She was right. The decision happened on the Keth flagship 4 minutes later, and it happened because Arch-Commander Veldrathos was 60 years old and had survived 9 planetary conquests and 3 command assignments, and had done it by being the kind of officer who looked at situations clearly and made correct assessments even when the correct assessment was the one he least wanted to make. He looked at his formation display, at the forward third in disarray, at the fire support platforms out of position, at the lunar systems preparing a 4th salvo, at the orbital grid that was still 78% active after everything his fleet had done to it, at the 2nd salvo damage assessment still coming in from 233 ships. He looked at all of it. Then he said, "Withdraw." His staff looked at him. "Full withdrawal," he said. "All elements, withdraw to the Mars orbital line and hold." "Sir, if we withdraw now." "If we withdraw now, we still have a fleet," Drathos said. "If we continue the assault, we lose the fleet and we still don't take the planet. The ground assault requires orbital superiority. We do not have orbital superiority. We did not achieve orbital superiority. We are not going to achieve orbital superiority against this grid with this fleet as currently configured." He looked at the display one more time. "Withdraw." The order went out. The fleet withdrew. In Peterson's operations center, the board showed the contacts pulling back slowly, because damaged ships moved slowly and 233 of them were damaged, toward the Mars orbital line. The fast attack elements at the forward edge pulled back last, covering the withdrawal of the larger vessels behind them, which was correct tactical doctrine, and which they executed competently even while taking continued fire from the grid nodes they were passing on the way out. Reyes watched them go. She watched until they reached the Mars orbital line and stopped, holding. Not retreating from the system entirely, holding at Mars, which meant they weren't done, which meant this wasn't over. She transmitted the contact status to the Joint Chiefs. Then she transmitted an updated assessment. Akafor read it in the command bunker and then read it again and then said to the room around her, "They're holding at Mars. What does that mean?" Her intelligence chief said, "It means they're not beaten. It means they're regrouping. The withdrawal was tactical, not strategic. They'll assess their damage, reorganize, bring up whatever additional assets they have in reserve and try again." Timeline. Unknown, days probably, maybe a week. A pause. "General, the Accord response to our information package, we're starting to receive it." Akafor looked at the communications board. Incoming transmissions from 15 Accord member states, all in the queue, all flagged high priority. She had known they would come, had sent the information package specifically to produce this response. But seeing them arrive in the specific weight of a crisis was different from expecting them in the abstract. "What are they saying?" Her communications officer began reading summaries. The Vethani Collective was offering medical assistance for the Strike City casualties and was requesting permission to send a fleet element to the Sol system. The Keth Sovereignty, different species, confusingly similar name, a perennial source of diplomatic frustration, was issuing a formal condemnation and offering defensive support. The Sorathi hegemony, which had historically been the most complicated relationship in humanity's Accord portfolio, had sent something that the communications officer read twice before summarizing. A full military support offer, unconditional, with a fleet that could reach Sol in 72 hours. The Sorathi. Unconditional. Akafar thought about the Resolution incident 4 years ago, and the fleet at the boundary, and the 381 names, and the relationship that had been difficult and complicated, and was apparently not so complicated that it wouldn't show up when the cities were hit. Accept all support offers, she said. Coordinate through the Accord emergency channel, and transmit my personal acknowledgement to each government. I'll record individual messages. She paused. The Sorathi specifically, make sure they know I read their offer personally, and I'll be calling their head of government directly. Yes, General. She turned back to the strategic display. To Mars and the Keth fleet holding there. To Earth and the 17 impact sites, and the response that was ongoing, and the 2,412 people who were dead, and the 6,000 more who were injured, and the hospital systems running at capacity across 4 continents. She thought about what came next. She thought about a fleet that had withdrawn but not retreated, holding at Mars, regrouping. She thought about whatever reserve assets they had and how many days she had before they tried again. She thought about the distributed grid and the lunar systems and the continuity of operations protocol and the Accord fleet elements that were now in transit toward Sol from multiple directions. She thought about Reyes in the operations center at Peterson, watching the board. She opened the channel. Reyes, she said. General. When they come back, and they're coming back, what does the second attempt look like? Reyes had been running this calculation since the Keth fleet reached the Mars line. She'd been running it because it was the right question, and because the operations center was quiet now that the immediate engagement was over and she had time to think. They know the grid now, she said. They know the lunar systems. They know our response pattern. A second attempt comes in differently, not fast attack forward, that failed completely. They'll reconfigure to saturate the lunar targeting, probably by distributing their formation to create more simultaneous engagement vectors than the rails can track. They'll target the grid differently, not trying to break through it but trying to destroy individual nodes until the overall coverage drops below a threshold. She paused. And they'll be angrier. Angrier. This isn't what they expected, General. They expected to be done by now. They expected the psychological window. They expected a civilization in shock and disarray, and instead they got us. That's going to produce a different operational posture in the second attempt. More aggressive, less precise. Anger makes attackers less precise. Akafar thought about this. Is less precise better or worse for us? Better, Reyes said. Precision was their strength. The distributed grid was designed specifically to defeat precision. You can't precision strike a distributed system because precision requires a point target. If they get less precise, they're playing on our ground. And the Accord fleet elements arriving in 72 hours. Change the math entirely, Reyes said. 2 things the Keth assessment got wrong: they didn't know what we had ready, and they didn't know we weren't alone. A pause. When the Sorathi fleet arrives, the Keth have to do the math on fighting us plus the Sorathi plus whatever else comes in. That's a different calculation than fighting just us. You think they'll reassess? I think they'll have to, Reyes said. This campaign was built on a strategic assumption. The assumption was wrong. A military that discovered its strategic assumption was wrong at the Mars line is going to be having very serious conversations about whether the campaign continues. The arch commander, whoever's running their fleet, has to go back to whatever authority sent him and say, "The assessment was wrong, what do you want to do now?" HFY was quiet for a moment. "And what do they do now?" she said. "That depends on what kind of empire they are," Reyes said. "Some empires, when they find the assessment was wrong, they double down. Pride, commitment to the original decision. They've announced this campaign internally, and backing down is politically costly." She paused. "Other empires do the math honestly and adjust." "Which kind are these?" Reyes looked at the Mars contacts, at the specific holding pattern of a fleet that had withdrawn and not scattered, that was maintaining coherent formation even while assessing damage, that had executed a fighting retreat with competence and discipline. "The second kind, I think," she said. "They withdrew when they should have withdrawn. That's not an emotional decision. That's a cold assessment." Another pause, "But I could be wrong." "If you're wrong, then they come back harder in 72 hours and we fight them with the Sorathi and whoever else arrives, and it gets very bad for a while." She said it flat and honest, the way she said most things. "But they don't take the planet. I'm confident of that." "Why?" Reyes thought about how to say it accurately. "Because they hit 17 cities on a Tuesday morning," she said. "And what they got was Chicago sending rescue teams into the impact zone and the lunar rails spinning up and the grid activating and me on the phone with you with a damage assessment." She paused. "They hit us to break our will. They didn't break our will. And without breaking our will, they can't hold this planet. You can bomb a people. You can't occupy a people who have decided not to be occupied." She paused again. "We decided 4,000 years ago not to be occupied. That's not in any assessment they could have run." HFY was quiet. "Then keep watching Reyes." "Yes, ma'am." The channel closed. Reyes turned back to her board. The Mars contacts were still there, still holding. 240 ships, minus the ones that had been destroyed in the engagement, which her count put at somewhere between 14 and 22, the uncertainty because some of the contact signatures were ambiguous and she was being conservative. 220 or so ships, damaged, regrouping. Behind Mars. She watched them. In the strike cities, the response continued. The rescue teams worked. The hospitals filled and the surgical teams worked through the night. The structural engineers went into the damaged blocks and assessed what could be saved and what couldn't. The communications infrastructure, which had been partially disrupted by the electromagnetic effects of 17 kinetic impactor detonations, came back online sector by sector as the repair crews worked through the restoration sequence. HFY recorded her personal messages to 15 Accord governments. The Sorathi government call was 23 minutes, longer than any of the others, longer than the protocol required. Because HFY had things to say, and the Sorathi head of government had things to say, and the things both of them had to say were the kind of things that required a real conversation rather than a diplomatic exchange. When the call ended, HFY's communications officer asked, "How did that go, General?" HFY thought about it. "We're going to be all right," she said. "Not about the battle, about the relationship." She went back to the strategic display. Drathos, on the flagship at the Mars orbital line, was having a different kind of conversation. He was having it with his fleet's senior officers, all of them, by secure channel, in the specific kind of military conference that happened when the situation required a collective reassessment. Not a pleasant conversation. Not the kind of conversation that anyone in the room had expected to be having at this point in the campaign. His intelligence officer presented the revised assessment. Not the original assessment, the revised one, built from 6 hours of battle data and 7 hours of pre-strike observation data that they had apparently been misinterpreting. The revised assessment said, The Terran Confederacy's military capability had been systematically underestimated. The distributed defense grid was not a mid-tier system. It was a specifically designed counter to precision assault doctrine. The lunar installation had been classified as decommissioned based on surface observation that had not accounted for the possibility that the humans had deliberately masked its operational status. The psychological response pattern had been modeled on 32 civilizations that did not share humanity's specific history of 4,000-year internal conflict, producing institutional mass casualty response infrastructure. The revised assessment also said the Accord fleet response was ongoing. At current trajectory, the Sorathi element would arrive at Sol in 68 hours, the Vethani element in 84, additional elements from 4 other Accord species in various timelines beyond that. The revised assessment concluded, the campaign as planned cannot achieve its objectives against the actual target as now understood. The campaign as planned was designed for the target as assessed. The target as assessed does not exist. Drathos presented this to his senior officers. One of them, his second-in-command, a younger officer named Fleet Captain Sarek, who had never commanded a campaign and had therefore never had to sit with the specific weight of a failed strategic premise, said, "We can modify the approach. The second attempt." "The second attempt," Drathos said, "faces a target that now knows our capabilities and has had 72 hours to reinforce and adapt, plus incoming Accord fleet elements from multiple directions, plus a civilian population and a military force that did not break under the opening strike." He looked at Sarek. "Against what do you propose to modify?" Sarek was quiet. "The assessment was wrong," Drathos said, not with anger, with the specific flatness of someone who has accepted an uncomfortable fact and moved on to what the fact required. "Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. We assessed a species based on 14 years of Accord-era behavior and concluded that those 14 years represented the species. They represented 14 years of a species that had chosen to be non-threatening in a diplomatic context." He paused. "They were not the species. They were a behavior pattern." Another pause. "The species is 4,000 years of warfare producing the specific institutional and military capabilities that stopped our opening assault and held the grid and fired the lunar rails and responded to 17 simultaneous kinetic strikes by sending rescue teams into the impact zones." The channel was quiet. "I am transmitting my recommendation to the Imperial Command," Drathos said. "The recommendation is withdrawal from the Sol system, full withdrawal back to Imperial space. The campaign cannot achieve its objectives." Sarek said, "Imperial Command will not." "Imperial Command will read the battle data," Drathos said, "and then they will read the Accord response data, and then they will read the revised assessment, and they will make the decision that the data supports." He looked at Sarek steadily. "I have spent 31 years in service to the Empire. I have never lost a campaign. I have never lost a campaign because I have never persisted in a campaign whose strategic foundation had failed." He paused. "This foundation failed. Admitting that is not defeat. Continuing despite that would be." He transmitted the recommendation. He waited. The response from Imperial Command took 4 hours, which was fast for Imperial Command, and which suggested that someone in the command structure had been reading the battle data in real time and had been coming to their own conclusions before the recommendation arrived. The response authorized withdrawal. Full withdrawal from the Sol system, immediate. Drathos ordered his fleet to plot the withdrawal course. He watched the formation begin to reorganize, the damaged ships first, beginning the slow process of turning and accelerating, the less damaged elements providing cover for the withdrawal in the correct tactical sequence. He thought about 33 worlds, about 32 conquests, and one that was not a conquest, about the specific shape of a mistake that had been built on a correct observation incorrectly interpreted. They had watched humanity for 11 years, and they had seen accurately that humanity preferred resolution to escalation. What they had not understood was that the preference for resolution did not mean the capacity for escalation was absent. It meant the capacity was there, was real, was enormous, and was held in reserve by conscious choice for the specific category of situation that the Keth Empire had today created. He thought about an intelligence officer, saying we assessed them as decommissioned about weapons that had not been decommissioned. He thought about what it meant that humanity had spent 19 years letting those weapons look decommissioned. Patient, very patient. The withdrawal course was plotted. The fleet began to move. On Earth, the detection board at Peterson showed the contacts leaving the Mars orbital line. Not toward Earth, away from it, toward the outer system, toward the transit corridor that led back to wherever they had come from. Reyes watched it. She watched it for a long time, because watching things was what she did, and because this particular thing warranted watching carefully to be certain it was what it appeared to be. It was. She opened the command channel for the last time that day. General HFY, she said. Reyes. The Keth fleet is withdrawing. Full system withdrawal, not a Mars hold. They're leaving. The pause on the other end of the channel lasted exactly 3 seconds. Confirmed, HFY said. Confirmed. All contacts moving on an outbound vector, speed and heading consistent with system transit, not repositioning. Reyes looked at the board one more time. They're gone, General, or they will be. Another pause, shorter. Thank you, Reyes, HFY said. Yes, ma'am. The channel closed. Reyes sat in the operations center at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado and looked at her board, at the outbound Keth contacts, at the 17 impact sites on Earth, still showing the thermal signatures of rescue operations and structural response, at the incoming Accord fleet elements, still on their way, still coming, because they had been told what had happened and they were coming anyway, not because the battle needed them, but because that was what Accord members did for each other and they had decided to do it. She looked at all of it. She picked up her coffee. It was cold. It had been cold for 7 hours. She drank it anyway. Then she started writing her incident report, because reports needed to be written while the details were clear, and because the people who would make decisions about the next 11 years needed accurate information about what the last 11 hours had actually been. She wrote it carefully. All of it. The contact detection, the attack geometry, the response pattern analysis, the lunar rail systems and the distributed grid and the continuity of operations protocol and the withdrawal recommendation, and the 4-second gap between the Keth's assessment of humanity and the human that humanity had turned out to be. She wrote about the coffee shops being open. She wrote about Chicago sending rescue teams. She wrote about 19 years of weapons that looked decommissioned. She wrote about what it meant when a species that had spent 4,000 years at war with itself decided, for 14 years, to be carefully diplomatic, and what it meant when that species was pushed past the point where careful diplomacy was the right tool. It was a long report. It was an accurate report. It was the kind of report that would be read in command schools for the next 30 years, by officers who needed to understand not just what had happened on that Tuesday in October, but why it had happened the way it had, why the Keth Empire had looked at humanity for 11 years and reached a conclusion that was technically correct and strategically catastrophic, and what that meant for every civilization in the galaxy that was thinking about humanity the same way. She filed it at 11:47 p.m. Then she went to find real coffee. The operations center had some in the back. Ensign Torres had told her hours ago. She had not had time to check. She had time now. She found it. It was fresh. Torres had apparently been maintaining it throughout the day, which was the kind of small and specific act of competence and consideration that made Reyes glad, every day, that she worked with the people she worked with. She poured a cup. She stood in the back of the operations center and drank it warm. Outside, Earth was still there, still rotating, still responding. The rescue team still working in 17 cities, the hospitals still running at capacity, the grid still active because you did not deactivate the grid until you were certain the situation warranted deactivating the grid, and Rays would not declare the situation warranted that for another 36 hours at minimum. The Accord fleets were still coming. They would arrive to find the battle over. They would arrive anyway because they had said they were coming, and they came when they said they were coming. The Keth fleet was in the outer system, moving fast, and would be in transit back to wherever it had come from by morning. Earth was still there. The coffee shops would open again tomorrow. The commuter trains would run. Not because nothing had happened, because something had happened, and the people who responded to it had done what the people who responded to things in this specific civilization did. They had sent rescue teams into the impact zones. They had run the grid. They had fired the rails. They had answered the Accord's messages and scheduled the calls and written the reports. They had been hit on a Tuesday morning, and they had not broken, and they had not retreated, and they were still here, and the people who had hit them were leaving. That was the shape of it. Rays finished her coffee. She went back to her board. She kept watching. The Keth Empire had studied humanity for 11 years. They had studied the right species for 11 years. They had simply failed to understand what they were studying, had taken 14 years of careful diplomacy as evidence of a limited capability for escalation, when it was actually evidence of a highly developed preference for not using a capability that had been sitting in the mountains for 19 years and on the orbital platforms for 30, and in the institutional muscle memory of a species for 4,000, waiting for the specific situation that required it. The situation had required it. The capability had been used. The Keth Empire had conquered 32 worlds. They never attempted a 33rd. Not because they lacked the military capacity to attempt it. They rebuilt their fleet over the following decade into something larger and more capable than what they had brought to Earth. Not because the imperial political will was absent. There were factions within the Keth imperial structure who argued for a second campaign for years. Because every time the argument was made, someone brought out the battle data from the Tuesday in October and read it again. And the fleet composition, and the lunar rails, and the distributed grid, and the Accord fleets arriving after the battle was over because they were coming anyway. And every time, the argument ran into the same wall. The wall was not the military capability, though the military capability was significant. The wall was the specific and irreducible fact of 17 cities hit on a Tuesday morning, and the coffee shops being open and Chicago sending rescue teams. The wall was what that meant. The Keth understood, after the Tuesday in October, what it meant. It meant the capability and the preference were not the same thing. It meant that the 14 years of careful diplomacy was a choice, not a limitation. It meant that the species that had spent 14 years being relentlessly non-threatening in a diplomatic context was not a species that had learned to be non-threatening. It was a species that had the option to be threatening and had decided, for 14 years, not to exercise it. And the specific thing that happened when you took that choice away from them, when you hit their cities on a Tuesday morning, was not shock and disorganization and the psychological window that the Keth doctrine required. It was Chicago. It was Rays on the phone with the Joint Chiefs at 6 in the morning. It was the coffee being cold for 7 hours because she had not had time to drink it. It was the thing that 4,000 years of being human had built, manifesting in 3 hours of preparation and 3 salvos of lunar rail fire, and a withdrawal order from an arch-commander who was old enough and honest enough to understand what he was looking at. The Keth Empire had conquered 32 worlds. The 33rd one watched them go and went back to work. The rescue teams were still in the impact zones. The grid was still active. The reports were being written. And the coffee shops in the cities that were still standing, and the cities that were rebuilding, and the cities where rescue teams worked through the wreckage of a Tuesday morning would open again tomorrow. That was not defiance. That was just what happened. That was just what they were. The end.